Is there truly a night when the living and the dead walk side by side? A night when the barrier between worlds grows so thin that even the breath of the wind might carry voices from the other side? For the Celts, this was not a question of imagination. It was a belief as real as the rising and setting of the sun. That night was Samhain, the threshold between the light of summer and the darkness of winter, between harvest and decay, between life and death. Imagine the fear and wonder of such a night. Families huddled by the fire, whispering prayers for protection. Food and drink left on doorsteps, not for neighbors, but for ancestors long gone. Strange shadows flickering in the mist, taken as signs that the veil had opened. But why did the Celts believe the veil grew thin at this precise moment in the year? Was it only myth, or did the cycle of the sun itself create the conditions for such a belief? In this episode, we journey deeper into Samhain's most haunting mystery, the night of the thin veil, where the cosmic cycle of light and darkness mirrors the passage between life and death. For the Celts, Samhain was not just the turning of the seasons. It was a moment when the world itself seemed to change. They believed that during this time, the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, a fragile boundary that no longer kept the two realms apart. This belief was not born from fear alone. The Celts honored their ancestors and saw death as part of a continuous cycle. To them, Samhain was a sacred doorway, when those who had passed could return for a single night, walking among their descendants. Families felt a deep responsibility to welcome these visitors with respect, offering food, drink, and warmth. Yet the thinning veil also carried danger. If kind and familiar spirits could return, so too could restless souls or malevolent beings. The Celts believed that on Samhain night, the world was alive with unseen presences, some protective, some threatening. It was a night when the ordinary rules of existence no longer applied. To the Celts, this idea of the veil was not fantasy, but truth, woven into the very rhythm of nature. As the sun's power waned and the earth sank into winter's silence, they saw the material world itself becoming more vulnerable, more open to forces beyond human sight. When the veil thinned during Samhain, the return of ancestors was not seen as a threat, but as a blessing. For the Celts, family ties did not end with death. The departed were still part of the community, guardians who watched over the living. Samhain was the moment when this connection became tangible, when the invisible could once again share the same space as the visible. To honor their ancestors, Celtic families prepared offerings of food and drink, often placed outside their homes or on special altars within. These were not symbolic gestures, but acts of genuine hospitality, a way of welcoming beloved spirits back into the circle of family life. Fires were lit to guide them through the darkness, their flames standing as beacons on the threshold between worlds. Inside the home, empty seats were sometimes left at the table, reserved for those who had passed. Meals were shared not only among the living but in memory of the dead, affirming that life and death were bound in an unbroken chain. In this sense, Samhain was a festival of remembrance as much as transition. It was a time when memory became presence and when the love of family bridged the gap between worlds. Through these rituals, the Celts ensured that no ancestor was ever truly lost. Yet the night of Samhain was not entirely one of comfort. If ancestors could cross the veil to return home, so too could other beings, restless, wandering, or even hostile. The Celts believed that, as the barrier weakened, the world filled with unseen presences, not all of them welcome. These spirits might cause mischief, illness, or harm to crops and livestock. To guard against them, communities relied on fire and disguise. Bonfires were lit not only as beacons for the dead, but as protection their flames believed to ward off dangerous forces. Families carried embers from these sacred fires back to their homes, rekindling their hearths with divine strength to keep darkness at bay. Masks and costumes were equally important. By disguising themselves, people hoped to confuse wandering spirits, making it harder for malicious entities to recognize or target them. What today survives as Halloween costumes began as a form of spiritual camouflage, an ancient defense against unseen dangers. This duality defined Samhain, a night of welcome and a night of fear. The same thin veil that allowed love and memory to return also opened the way for chaos. To survive the night, the Celts had to honor, to protect, and to endure, balancing reverence with caution as they stepped into the shadowed hours of Samhain. For the Celts, Samhain was not only a night of spirits, it was also a night of visions. When the veil grew thin, they believed the future could be glimpsed, as though the unseen world allowed fragments of destiny to slip through. Divination was woven into Samhain traditions, often practiced in the glow of firelight. Apples, a sacred fruit, played a central role. Young people bobbed for apples in water, believing that success foretold luck in love and marriage. Nuts were thrown into the fire. If they burned brightly together, it meant harmony between future partners. If they split apart, separation was destined. Other rituals involved gazing into flames or the reflection of candles in water, seeking messages from the spirit world. Some cast stones or bones, interpreting patterns as signs of what lay ahead. To the Celts, these were not games, but serious attempts to align with the hidden order of the universe. Samhain, then, was more than remembrance. It was a threshold of possibility when past, present, and future touched. By opening themselves to visions, the Celts embraced the idea that fate was not distant, but woven into the same cosmic cycle that carried the sun, the seasons, and the soul itself. The idea of a thinning veil was not unique to the Celts. Across the world, many cultures sensed that there were moments in the year when the living and the dead could meet. These times often fell during autumn, when the natural world seemed to wither, and the rhythm of life turned toward silence. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead carries striking similarities to Samhain. Families create altars with offerings of food, flowers, and candles, welcoming ancestors back for a night of reunion. The belief is not one of fear, but of remembrance and celebration, echoing the Celtic idea that death is part of life's cycle. In Japan, the festival of Obon honors ancestral spirits through lanterns, dances, and offerings, guiding souls home before they return to the other world. In China, the Hungry Ghost Festival marks a time when restless spirits wander among the living, requiring rituals of feeding and protection. These traditions, though separated by oceans and centuries, share a common truth. Humanity has always felt that the boundary between life and death is not fixed, but shifting, and that certain moments open a door between worlds. Samhain, then, is not just a Celtic story. It is part of a universal human understanding, that the cycles of nature reflect the cycles of the soul, and that every culture seeks to bridge the distance between the living and the dead. Samhain was the night when boundaries dissolved, a time to honor ancestors, to guard against wandering spirits, and to seek glimpses of the future. It was both sacred and dangerous, a reminder that life and death are not opposites, but partners in the same eternal dance. The thinning of the veil was more than superstition. It reflected the cosmic rhythm of the year, when the sun's retreat into winter mirrored humanity's passage through endings and beginnings. For the Celts, this was truth. Death was not an end, but a transition, and Samhain was the night when that truth became visible. But the mystery of Samhain does not end here. In our next episode, we will step deeper into the cosmic cycle, exploring how the movements of the sun and stars shaped not only the calendar, but the very soul of Celtic spirituality.